Today's episode is sponsored by Future State Media, experts in off-Amazon traffic for Amazon sellers. Future State Media will build you a custom-made website to deliver sales for you on Amazon. Built to grab traffic from search engines and social media, your site can be used as a secret weapon for launching products on Amazon or just to stabilize your Amazon sales. It means you can also build an email list on autopilot. Go to futurestatemedia.com for your free guide to Google SEO for Amazon sellers today. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the 10K Collective podcast, a subset of the Amazing FBA podcast aimed at 6 to 8 figure sellers. And we're definitely going to be needing to address the more advanced sellers in a lot of cases today. We're talking to Brian Miller of Easy China Warehouse. He's the CEO and founder, and they are global e-commerce fulfillment service from China. So Brian, warm welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
Good to have you here. So you're coming to us from where exactly today?
Yeah, so we're located in Shenzhen, China. For those who are not familiar with where it is, we border Hong Kong. So if anyone's familiar with where Hong Kong is, we're the border city to Hong Kong.
Yeah, and pretty hot where you are today, as I understand.
Yeah, we're about, I'll do both. We're 90 Fahrenheit and about 30 plus Celsius. So for all the international people here, you know.
Excellent. So you're able to speak fluently in both worlds, and I think that's an important it's an important lesson for Americans when you're shipping in from China. You have to get your head around the metric system because that's what a lot of that's what the world is working on outside of the US, so including China, as I understand. So the small things. So the first thing we're going to talk about then in this episode is talk about the current situation. So this is one of those episodes that may be out of date by the time you hear it, but I think it's good to catch up on where China's at with the freight situation and stuff right now with the virus and how that's affected things. But before we do that, tell us a bit about yourself, because obviously an American in Shenzhen, interesting story is normally behind that. So what took you there in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Connecticut in the US, and I've been in China for the last 10 years. I originally actually left the US in '08, so the last crisis that we had in the world, the financial crisis. And that's when I graduated university and no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I actually traveled through Europe, the Middle East, and I ended up in Asia where I had a friend who started a business. And he told me, you got to come out to Asia. Everything's happening here. The economy is growing like crazy. And everything's moving much faster than we're used to in the West. So that's when I came out to Taiwan, and I started to get myself acquainted with China. I started learning Chinese in Taiwan, and eventually I moved to Beijing to continue studies. And then after that, I worked for one of the largest Chinese state-owned manufacturers in the world. So I actually worked for the Chinese government, a manufacturing facility managing their North American export operations. So we would manufacture industrial components in China and export them to the US and sell them to large multinationals. And that's kind of how I got into China. And from that, I learned manufacturing and actually started my own FBA business where I still own. I sell Bluetooth speakers on Amazon. And from there, I started business that I have today that kind of you introduced me as, which is Easy China Warehouse. And we do global e-commerce fulfillment for e-commerce companies.
Excellent. And so that I like to know that there's a bit of depth of background about guests, because it's just, if people are going to hand over their hard made goods and get them shipped around the world, they need to know that they're dealing with somebody who's got a solid, deep background. And it's great to have, to know that you speak the language properly. And it sounds obvious, but some people are just have popped up 3 minutes ago in the Amazon world, right? I myself probably didn't have much of a background at all when I first started doing the podcasting here. Now, I guess from a few years of it, you gain some experience, but also good that you sell an FBA yourself, so you understand the game really well. And yeah, because occasionally worked with freight forwarders who don't do Amazon normally, and that's quite a different learning curve for them, right? So, so tell me a little bit about what you guys do at Easy China Warehouse, and then we'll get into talking about the situation.
Yeah, sure. So like kind of building on what you said about me being an e-commerce seller as well, I think that's what makes us a bit different from most other people, is that in the freight forwarding market is that we really understand what e-commerce sellers kind of need and what they're looking for and the services that they require to like kind of support them after they manufacture their products. And that's kind of why I started the company. I was an e-commerce seller and I just found how difficult it was to take it from the factory and get it to each individual Amazon FBA warehouse around the world. Um, and so we have a warehouse in Shenzhen, and what we do is we help global e-commerce sellers store their product in China, so they can send it to our warehouse and store their products there. And then as they need inventory around the world, we will ship it by air or sea to the applicable Amazon FBA warehouse that they need it shipped to. So we can ship to the US and Europe, all the FBA markets, Japan, Canada, Australia, Mexico. Um, and we help them kind of distribute their inventory around the world so that they don't have to take product from China, ship it a whole container to the US, and then realize that they need inventory in Japan and have to ship it back. So for people that really sell in many places and have a hard time estimating sales velocity, we kind of support them and give them a more flexible solution to distribute their products after manufacturing.
Yeah, sounds great. And I have to say, like, who doesn't have a problem knowing exactly what velocity will be? I mean, I was saying to somebody the other day who's new to this business, look, you will either be overstocked or understocked. Let's make our peace with that now and decide which side you want to err on. So having some flexibility in the system is incredibly important. So that sounds like a very powerful and obviously important part of the supply chain there. And they say, if you correct mistakes early, it's cheap, and if you correct them late in any process, it's expensive, right? So that the earlier you can do that makes sense. Well, we're going to come into the detail of that in our next episode. Let's come back to the current situation in China. I mean, we've got a little list of things here. The first of which I've got is how it started. Now, I guess that's going to be possibly the subject of an international investigation if China decides to let Australia do it. And I'm sure Mr. Trump has a few strong ideas about that. But let's talk about more maybe than epidemiology. Everyone's an amateur epidemiologist these days, if I can say the word. But what was it like from your experience on the ground? Were you in China the whole time, back in sort of late December, early January?
Yeah, so I'll give you a perspective. We'll try to take politics out of it and just
Yes,
kind of tell you
indeed.
what
Let's do that.
tell you what I saw, at least as kind of a person that's just living in China here.
Yes.
So in December, this is December 2019. I'll just give some dates so that people can kind of remember for the show. We started to hear about a virus in the news. People weren't really sure about what it was. People were a bit not concerned at the time because they didn't really know much about the virus. And basically what we heard is to not worry. There's not a lot of human to human transmission. Um, so that was like kind of what we first heard in December when no one knew what was happening. And December 31st is when the Chinese government officially announced that there's this virus. Okay. So at that point, people kind of realized that it's an important thing to take note of. And people were more concerned at that point. I would say by the first and second week of January, you see most of the people in China started to wear masks. So a lot different from the rest of the world, where it took a while for people to kind of adopt this type of behavior. But within 1 week in January, you'd say about half of the people in China were wearing masks, and by mid-January, I'd say almost everyone had a face mask on. So very quickly, you can see a ramp up of kind of, let's say, fear within society. People were concerned, and people were taking that action. And at the same time, places around China started to take temperature checks everywhere that you went. So at all the supermarkets, at all the malls, any public place that you went to, they would check your temperature before entering, and also not allow you in without a mask. So we saw very quick measures to try to trace what was happening and where the virus was going. And this extended into banks and uh, eventually my apartment. So, like my own home, I would need to actually get a temperature check to go in and also register where I'd been. So, that's the first month of January, how fast it kind of ramped up. So from there, we after that in February, which was after Chinese New Year, the government created new rules for companies to open, and those included registering employees and doing temperature checks for the employees and reporting any high fevers to the government, and certain sanitation and disinfection techniques that we had to do to sanitize the facility every day, and also provide protection equipment for our employees. And that's kind of what slowed down the supply chain actually after the Chinese New Year. So a lot of people had trouble their factories had trouble getting started. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that government safety inspectors in China had to go to these facilities and approve to commence work. And so that was kind of the first thing that we saw that slowed down the supply chain for a lot of people that, sell on Amazon. And the second big thing was just migrant labor. So in China, as we know, a lot of people come from the countryside to large cities to work in a lot of the manufacturing facilities. And because of the very strict quarantines around China, um, these migrant workers had a hard time getting back to these factories. So not only did you have a hard time kind of opening the factory, but also with the safety inspector, but also when you opened, you had a shortage of labor to actually do the manufacturing. So that's kind of brings us quickly through February and what kind of happened up till then.
Thank you. Very interesting to get a perspective because we all obviously a lot of us are glued to our screens and our phones and reading papers and whatever sources of information. Facebook, obviously, a very reliable source of news. It seems to be the rage. Yeah. By the way, lots of people on Facebook, guys, and the prices for advertising are down. I'm just saying, but the story in China sounds like the sort of thing that Western governments have gradually approached very slowly. It sounds like the Chinese did in 2 weeks what it's taken Britain about 4 months to come to the idea that maybe we should wear something that stops infection when you walk into a shop. But it's all a bit late in Britain. It sounds like the Chinese moved really fast, and there's hot debate obviously in the US as well. And I'm not going to get into the politics there, but that's interesting about the supply chain there. Is that's kind of our business as FBA sellers. What would you say is the situation now then? I mean, are most migrant workers back? And what do you think is the effect on businesses currently? This is in early May that we're recording this in 2020. What would you
Yeah.
say is the
So,
current situation? How fluently can factories operate?
yep. So, yeah, I'll just kind of take it from February. So, in February, we saw like kind of factories start to open. And I would say by March, we saw most of the factories, at least they were open, and they were moving from about 50% capacity. I'd say by the end of March, we were close to like 80+% capacity. So we had most of the manufacturing back online at the end of March for sure. Um, and April, we've been very normal with manufacturing. Actually, a lot of the factories are having trouble now financially just because, you know, they originally, couldn't open, and then the virus spread to the rest of the world. So there's kind of a demand shock. There's not as much people that are releasing orders to these factories, and they're kind of low on orders. So we've seen a lot of factories actually go on vacation for a few months and close down while the virus kind of increased around the world. So the factories are having a tough time at the moment. But there's plenty of capacity in the market to manufacture whatever you need now.
How interesting. I mean, what's interesting is interviewing people over the course of the progression of this virus in different parts of the world. And this is one particular type of shock, but there are other shocks. I mean, if you were selling an Amazon Japan in, was it 2011 when the Fukushima reactor got taken down by the tsunami, there are other things in the world that can happen. So it's interesting how it progresses because there's one part of the system that goes down really early, China, and the production side primarily. Although a lot of Chinese consumers are major consumers, I guess most FBA sellers don't sell direct to them, right? And then that comes back online, and then you got the demand side shock, which I guess means we just got to keep navigating through those waters. I mean, right now, I guess the obvious thing is to try and strike a deal with your Chinese supplier whereby possibly the unit price is actually more in your favor, but you may need to put a more substantial order down, that kind of thing, right? So we can get into the detail of that, but I think there are again opportunities in that situation for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
you have a great point. Like originally there was a supply shock, so kind of the factory had a lot of the leverage, right?
yeah,
After the opening of the factories after Chinese New Year,
yeah,
and now it's a great point that like now you have a demand shock, so now the buyer has all the power. So it is a good idea. You probably have some leverage to go back to your factory right now and say, hey, what can we do about price? Obviously, you can't beat them down too hard because they don't have a lot of orders,
no, of
but
course.
but there's definitely an open conversation that you can have now to see if you can get any improvement in price or whatever for your product for sure.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of I mean, obviously, I appreciate you're not in the manufacturing game, but my understanding is that the raw material costs have gone up. But having said that, you've got a lot of migrant workers that have come back and need the income, and I guess that the Chinese average wage has been shooting up year by year for a long time now. So maybe if it stalls for a while, that should at least mean you have stable pricing for the labor component of it, right? So I guess it's a balance between the raw materials and labor factors from where I see it. What's your experience on the ground there?
Yeah, I would say it also depends on the type of commodity that you're making. So
Yeah.
for my Bluetooth speakers, they haven't moved in price at all.
Mm.
I imagine that anything that is also using anything that has the same materials as PPE, so personal protection equipment, now that's very popular.
Yeah.
You might be fighting for those raw materials, but if you're outside of that supply chain, I imagine that prices should be relatively stable, at least from what we've seen.
Interesting. Yeah. Right, let's come back to freight. So your specialist area, obviously, and the mastermind. So air freight, first of all, I know that there's been a lack of passenger flights. They take what 50-60% of the world's freight. So
Yep.
that's been an effect. How has that been progressing? Is that sort of stabilizing now, or is that been going up and up?
Yeah, so this has been a headache for us as people that ship a lot of the freight. It's been kind of hell for me every
I
day.
imagine
But
that.
but yeah, like basically you're exactly right. With the passenger, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of freight is actually shipped in the belly of most passenger flights. So about 50% plus of the world's air freight is shipped by passenger planes. And so we have 50% of the capacity out of the market. And then we have an increased demand. And the demand comes from a few places. The first is just delayed factories. So a lot of factories were delayed in their orders after Chinese New Year because of the virus. And so everyone wanted to put their stuff on a plane as opposed to a boat to kind of get their products back to their marketplace and back in inventory. And the second is all the PPE, so the personal protection equipment that we're sending to hospitals all around the world. So that could be masks or those kind of full body suits, those hazmat suits, are really overloading the air freight kind of uh, capacity. And we're seeing air freight rates go up every single week to prices I've never personally seen before, way higher than Q4. So mostly we see like a ramp up in Q4 going into the holiday season in prices for air freight, but these prices have gone much higher than those prices in the past. But actually, luckily today, it's funny that we're speaking today, but we had our first reduction in price for air freight today. So it seemed to hit the peak. I hope it will keep going down. But it's the first reduction in price that we've had in months. So if that's something to expound upon, hopefully we'll see more reductions in the coming weeks.
Interesting, but I mean, for the moment, it does sound like even if it reduces from the peak. I mean, peak is one thing, and it's the same with virus. Everyone's like, "Yay, we're past the peak." I'm like, that means people are still gonna die, right? I mean, just saying, peak
Yeah,
does not mean it's over. It means it
right.
stopped, going up. But I mean, nevertheless, relative to, I guess, this time last year, so March, or say May 2019, I guess it's way more expensive, right? I mean, how does the year-on-year price compare roughly for air freight?
Yeah, two to three times the normal price at the
Whoa,
moment.
okay. So a
So
300%
yeah.
increase and then minus like a few percent is still massive increase, isn't it? So we clearly need an alternative to that to make the economics work for most products. So tell me about the alternatives that you've seen and indeed that you guys get involved with, because that's obviously a critical part of the cost base of each product, right? The unit economics.
Yeah, so I mean, luckily the capacity in the actual freight market, the sea freight market, has stayed stable. So we haven't seen any price differences compared to last year in the sea freight market. So obviously, we're recommending our customers as much as they can to ship by sea, of course. Um, and what we do as a company is we help actually a lot of small sellers consolidate their freight into one container, and we bring that container over to a market like the US and ship it into Amazon for a lot of sellers. So we are recommending that. We ship two different methods. One we call a fast boat and one a slower one. The faster boat moves out of Ningbo, and the slower one comes from Shenzhen. But we are recommending that people order a bit more and try to ship even if they have to get some of their product to market, we recommend just a very small portion by air, as least as they can before the sea freight comes in. So that's what we're doing with a lot of customers. If they have 100 units, maybe they send 15 by air, and we try to take 85 and put them on a ship to keep their cost low.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me on this sort of the reasons why you need to stay in stock side, and it becomes such a religion and a panic for Amazon sellers, particularly because Amazon can shift a lot of units of anything at any given time, that it becomes a religion and you stop thinking why you bother. And one thing that strikes me, which isn't a freight thing, but it is related to how much you order, is the fact that if everybody is out of stock, then you're not going to lose ranking relative to other people. And I think that the panic about air freighting stuff in as you would normally becomes more questionable when it's 300% more expensive than this time last year, right? I mean, you've got to
For
balance
sure.
it up. That's not really a freight question, but of course, it's the kind of sales manager panicking about not being able to sell stuff. Creates a possibly ridiculous system for the freight manager, if you like. Most FBA businesses are too small to have those departments split between two different people. But if you had them, I think it's an important conversation to have with yourself or with your business partner. But having
Yeah.
said that, assuming that you air freight as little as possible and you get them by sea, tell me what fast means. I mean, fast is always a great word for, we always love the word fast. Does that mean like you're getting there in the same time as air freight, or is it sort of 30 days, 60 days? What sort of time frame?
It's close. So as far as we call it the fast boat to the West Coast to Amazon, if there's no customs check, which there are occasionally random custom check, you usually can get the product there between 20 and 25 days after the ship leaves. So that's quite quick through customs and to an Amazon West Coast warehouse. And for the slower boat, we're around 25 to 30 days. Now that's after the boat departs. So usually for us, we load the container on Thursday and the boat departs on a Sunday. So once it departs on that Sunday, we can get it to Amazon within 25 to 30 days. Now, for a lot of people that do air freight, oftentimes it takes 2 weeks to do air freight. So if you want to put it on a faster boat, you have 3+ weeks, 4 weeks. It's not that much longer when you think about it in that term. And actually, what we're seeing as a very large trend recently, which is surprising, I know a lot of people are kind of worried about losing their ranking if they're out of stock. But we're seeing a lot of our bigger customers that do ship a lot. They're worried less and less about running out of stock. So we see them out of stock sometimes. They tell us they're out of stock and they still ship by sea. So they're less, it seems like more sellers, at least that we're working with, are less concerned about that kind of Amazon issue where you lose ranking because they find that once they get back in stock, they see a pretty quick uptick in their ranking after the stock comes back in. So I think it's also something some sellers should think about to maybe not worry so much about that.
I agree. I think it's part of the overall thing of reassessing what you're doing because we all get into habits and day to day, week to week, that's not a bad thing as a way of running a business. But I think you've got to reassess. And this situation, every time you open a newspaper or a magazine that the journalists are stuck at home without real reporting to do, they're all speculating and saying we ought to reassess everything. But it's true that you have to. And without being abstract about it, let's be concrete. If you happen to have used air freight, you need to look at the unit economics and go, well, 300% increase, that's no longer viable. So that side is very strong. And then the other thing is ranking is relative. You have to just remember that panic to stay in stock, which Amazon's trained us like, Pavlov's dogs to worry about staying in stock. That serves the customers, that serves Amazon, but it doesn't serve our business if we're paying so much money to stay in stock to serve the sacred customer that we're losing money on the deal. That's kind of insane. And actually, if everyone else is in the same position, exactly what you just said, I think it's really important to reevaluate the upsides and the downsides of both those. Just because you've been doing that until, say, January this year doesn't mean it's the right thing to do now. And I think that's true for a lot of things, right? We just have to take the situation as a fresh situation, evaluate it fresh, and then often come to some unusual conclusions like this fast boat. Really, as you say, that the difference between the speed of the fast boat, if it's basically 3 weeks, and air freight, which is now presumably slower, if it's 2 weeks slower than it has been, there's really not much difference. And if you're going to pay like
Yeah.
3-4x for your shipping for 1 week, is that really going to make that much difference anyway? If you're out of stock for 2 weeks versus three, I think there's a lot of reason to change over, right? And it sounds like your clients are doing the same. Is that what you found?
Yeah, they are. And actually, to be honest, like a lot of people don't even choose the fast boat anymore because the fast boat is actually relatively more expensive than the slower one, and it's only one more week. So like
Yeah.
in 4 weeks, our slowest boat is like 4 weeks, and the cost savings from 3 to 4 is really high. So people can also accept like 2 more weeks on top of the normal air freight, and we're seeing tons of wait times in DHL. Even if you choose the fastest shipping in the world, like DHL or UPS, we're seeing a lot of wait times in the warehouse before it actually gets shipped. So there's like even a line for DHL and UPS. So you're paying such a premium, you're waiting in line for a week, and then you get there in 10 days, and it seems to not really be worth it anymore at this point.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's a question of really aligning your, I suppose you could get into lean manufacturing and all sorts of complex concepts, but it's basically aligning your supply chain with the needs of the market. And right now, if the market is saying, well, my competition's also out of stock, and also there's a degree to which I guess Amazon is probably being less aggressive towards its sellers than usual because it recognizes there are supply chain shortages, and also the expectation of consumers has changed a bit in recent weeks because they've had to get used to waiting 2 or 3 whole weeks for something when they're normally used to getting it
Mm-hmm.
in 24 hours if you're in the UK, or 24, 48 hours in the US. So interesting. So yeah, that's a good place to leave it there, really. I guess I should just give you a quick chance to summarize what you guys do in terms of how that works with your consolidation service, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so basically what we do is we help a lot of small sellers consolidate into one container. So we will take 5 to 10 or 5 to 20 different sellers, and we will take all their products in China and label them with UPS or FedEx labels before we load the container. And we'll load a whole container, and we'll bring that container directly to the port and right onto the ship. So the fact that it's already consolidated before it gets to the uh, port means that we get it on the ship much quicker, and we can guarantee that we'll get it on the next boat that leaves. So that's an important thing in speed. That's why our speed is so quick, is because we've already loaded it before the port. And then we bring that whole container through customs and pass it on basically directly to UPS where they make final delivery. So by doing that and speeding up the deconsolidation process and the shipment on to Amazon FBA, because they're already labeled, they're already ready to go when we open the container in the US, we speed up the other side, which is when you deconsolidate the container. So that's why the times are specifically usually faster than most. And we share all of those fees that you get from one container across all the sellers in the container. So instead of each person paying like all the different filing fees and all the different fees that a traditional forwarder would charge you, we take that one fee and split it amongst everyone. So it's usually faster, and it's also usually more cost effective than most other LCL models.
Excellent, faster and cheaper. It's hard to argue with that, really, as long as the quality is good as well. Which again, without questioning your abilities, I mean, it just comes down to you just got to assess these things in the end, based on breakages or speed or whatever. But I guess that the logic of it makes sense to at least try it out. So it's faster and cheaper, and I can see. I mean, the nice thing is that when you can see transparently why things are faster or cheaper, then you don't have to be so worried, and it's kind of obvious that your system is more efficient because you're doing the messy, tricky stuff well away from the ports where the constraint of capacity
Yep.
can be. So it makes total sense. And if people want to explore working in that with you, how do they get hold of you, Brian? What's the best way?
Yeah, so one of two ways. One is easychinawarehouse.com. They can go to our website and fill in the contact form, or they can email me directly, Brian, Brian, at easychinawarehouse.com.
Great. I loved your caution spelling, Brian, but you never know, do you? So who's listening?
A lot of
Thank you very
people
much.
spell brain. Yeah, brain, Brain.
Oh
So
wow.
be careful about that.
Yeah, Brian, folks. If you heard it here first. So, Brian, thank you very much for talking us through that. Very interesting to hear what it's like on the ground, and yeah, it makes sense to at least check out the consolidation service. It makes a lot of sense to me. So, thanks for going through that.
Sure.